Let's begin with a word of prayer together. O risen Lord, as you spoke Mary's name in that garden so long ago, and you spoke to us in our baptism, calling us by name, so this Easter morning, may you come and speak into each heart here today, telling them that you are risen, that you are the Lord of life, that you are the one we can follow and find eternal life. Amen. What is the greatest upset of all time? If you're a college basketball fan like I am, the answer happened a couple of weeks ago in an unlikely place and time. A number 16 seed, which is the lowest seed you can be in the tournament, called the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, defeated the number 1 overall seed in the tournament, which is the highest possible seed you can get, the University of Virginia, by 20 points. Up until that time, number 1 seeds had never lost to a number 16 seed. They were 134-0. And now Virginia has the unlikely honor of being the 134-1. UMBC soon became known by another acronym, You Must Be Cinderella. Then another team came and captured our hearts in the tournament over the last few weeks, the University of Loyola Chicago, a small Catholic school that plays in the same conference as UNI up in Cedar Falls. They upset 4 higher seeds in order to reach yesterday's Final Four. And their chaplain, you've all heard by now, is a 98-year-old nun named Sister Jean, pictured there on the right, who prays with them before each game, cheers them on. In her pregame prayer, often gives them scouting reports on the other team, and sends encouraging emails to the players before and after the game. And she came in very handy last night, I think, as Loyola finally ran out of gas and lost to Michigan. I'm sure Sister Jean used every bit of her consoling and comforting words to encourage those wonderful players from Loyola. What is the greatest upset of all time? If you're a wrestling fan from Iowa, you may remember what happened in 1970 when Dan Gable of West Waterloo High and then Iowa State lost the last match of his college career to Larry Owings of Washington. Until that time, in high school and college, Dan Gable's record was 181 victories and 0 defeats. Or if you're a hockey fan, we will never forget the Miracle on Ice, where the U.S. Olympic team defeated the seemingly invincible Soviet Union. And Al Michaels' classic call at the end of that game was this: do you believe in miracles? And if you read the Bible, you quickly discover some miraculous things, some miraculous upsets. What's the greatest upset of all time in the Bible? Well, one of the nominees would be the story that we heard about Thursday night, the Passover time, the battle between Moses and the number 1 seed of his day, the Pharaoh of Egypt, and how Egypt, or rather Israel, fled in the middle of the night out of Egypt. The army of Pharaoh chased them in their chariots. They came to the Red Sea waters, facing certain death. And God said to Moses, as you see in the image on the left, raise your hand, raise your staff, and the waters parted. And Israel went through on dry land, every single one of them. And when they got to the other side and felt the ground rumbling as those chariots of Israel or of Egypt were coming after them, God told Moses, now close your hands over the water. And as he did, those waters drowned the army of Pharaoh, saving Israel. What's the greatest upset of all time? You might think about the story of David and Goliath, the ultimate 16 seed taking on a number 1, Goliath of Gath, a giant, the champion of the Philistines. But again, with God's miraculous power at work, David picked up a small stone, put it in his slingshot, threw it at the giant, and hit him square in the center of his head, and the giant dropped, leading Israel to a great victory. What's the greatest upset of all time? Those stories and the stories of sports pale in comparison to what happened long ago on this morning, the resurrection of Christ from the dead. This is the event that split history into 2 pieces. We call them AD and BC. Something powerful had to happen to cause that split. Death was the number 1 seed of all time, undefeated for millennia, other than a couple of rare exceptions in the Bible that I know you Bible scholars would remind me of if I didn't mention them. Enoch and Elijah. Death had never lost. Abraham died. Moses died. David died. Everybody died from Adam and Eve onward till that morning. But then death met its match in the resurrected Christ. Until that morning, dead people stayed dead, pure and simple. That's what Mary Magdalene believed when she went in the dark to that garden and found the startling sight of the stone being rolled away. She ran to find Peter and the other disciple and told them again, dead people stay dead. She said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. They had no idea what was about to happen. This was the original March Madness. This was the ultimate April Fool's joke about to be played. And so Peter and John run to the tomb and see for themselves. And what do they think? The gospel writer tells us that they didn't understand what Jesus had told them many times before that day, that he must rise from the dead. There is no Jesus is risen coming out of their lips. It's going to take more than an empty tomb to convince them that death has been defeated and Jesus is alive. It's going to take an encounter with the risen Christ. And that's what we see happening to Mary Magdalene. She becomes the first witness to the resurrection after her conversation with those 2 men in white sitting on the slab, and then hearing her voice called by that mysterious figure that she thought was the gardener. She hears her name called, Mary. Faith comes when we hear our name called, when we encounter the risen Christ in one way or another, in one place or another. And as St. Paul wrote in that lesson that was read, Jesus had a way of just keep showing up. He showed up to the disciples, to many others, as you see on the screen. Cephas, which is Peter, the 12, 500 brothers and sisters all at the same time, and finally to him on the Damascus road. That's a lot of showing up. But that's what Easter's about, everyone. It's about Jesus showing up where there's death and bringing life. He has defeated the number 1 seed of all time, death, and kept his promise that he spoke at the grave of Lazarus about a week before the story of Easter. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And all of this was done for you. All of this was done for you. For if it hasn't happened already, there will come a day in your life that feels like Good Friday felt for Mary and the disciples. Tragedy and loss have a way of knowing where we live. There will come a day, if it hasn't already, when you feel like Mary and you have lost a dear loved one and you desperately need Easter hope. And thanks to this day, we are no longer people without hope. For we know that the number one seed of all time has been knocked off. Death has been defeated. And you can dare to know and believe that you will see your loved ones again one day when you join them, when Jesus calls your name, and you will have the rest of your life, eternity, to enjoy that relationship. You have hope today, not just for that event down the road, whenever that is, but also for today, that the world as it is can be different. We need hope in our day, especially for our children and our grandchildren, for they are growing up in a world vastly different, isn't it, from the world that we grew up in. We never worried about things like school shootings, but when we were growing up, death was powerful too, just in different ways. There were marches when we were growing up, many of us, only for different reasons. 50 years ago this week, young soldiers were coming back in caskets by the hundreds from Vietnam. 50 years ago this coming Wednesday, April 4th, death lurked in the shadows as Martin Luther King stepped out on that balcony in Memphis, Tennessee at the Lorraine Motel. And when that shot rang out and Dr. King fell dead, it seemed like Good Friday all over again. It seemed like death had won. That same night, Robert Kennedy had scheduled a campaign appearance in Indianapolis, and he chose, without police protection, to go into the ghetto of Indianapolis to speak to the crowd shortly after hearing the news that King had died. And in the dark, on April 4th, 50 years ago, he spoke the words you see on the screen. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred, violence, or lawlessness. But what we need is love and wisdom, compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. And my friend, those words are as true today as they were 50 years ago. And those words were grounded in the hope of Easter, grounded in the cross of Christ, grounded in the power of God to bring life out of death, victory out of defeat, and hope out of despair. And so on this Easter morning, 50 years after that fateful year of 1968, where both Dr. King and in 2 months later, Robert Kennedy were slain, may we all dedicate ourselves to the ideal that Bobby Kennedy expressed, which is rooted in the gospel, to be people full of love and wisdom and compassion toward each other. And may we dedicate ourselves to be workers of justice on behalf of those who suffer in our country and in our world, especially our children in school. Most of all, on this Easter morning, may you dedicate yourself anew to be followers of Jesus Christ, the one who triumphed over death, the greatest upset of all time. Amen.